year was 1992, and the streets of Newark, New Jersey, buzzed with activity. As a city bus driver, my life was built on routine. Each day, I navigated the familiar streets, picking up and dropping off passengers along my route. My shift ended at midnight, and I always looked forward to the quiet, empty ride back to the depot. But one night, everything changed. It started innocuously enough. One evening, while on my break, I wandered into a small, dusty antique shop I had never noticed before. The store was filled with old trinkets and forgotten relics. My eyes fell on a peculiar item in a glass case, a silver pocket watch with an intricate design. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a weathered face, saw my interest and approached. "That watch has quite the history," he said, his voice raspy. "Belonged to a bus driver from the 1920s. They say it's cursed, but it's a beautiful piece, isn't it?" I laughed off the notion of a curse and bought the watch for a fair price. I liked the idea of having a bit of history with me, something to pass the time during long shifts. That night, as I drove my usual route through the dimly lit streets of Newark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The watch felt unusually heavy in my pocket, and every time I glanced at it, the hand seemed to tick just a bit slower than normal. By the time my shift ended, the streets were deserted, and I parked the bus in the depot. The next morning, as I arrived at the depot to start my shift, my supervisor, Tony, called me into his office. He looked concerned as he handed me a VHS tape. "This is from your bus's CCTV footage last night," he said. "You need to see this." Confused, I inserted the tape into the player and watched the footage. My heart pounded as I saw myself driving an empty bus through areas of the city that weren't on my route. The timestamp showed hours that I didn't remember. It was as if I had entered a trance, my face expressionless and my eyes vacant. The footage ended with the bus parked at the depot, but I had no memory of how I got there. Tony looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "What the hell happened, Jack?" "I don't know," I stammered. "I don't remember any of this." Haunted by gaps in my memory, I knew I had to piece together the lost hours and understand the sinister implications of my actions during that time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to retrace my steps from the previous night. The first place I visited was the last stop on my official route. The streets were empty, the only sound a distant hum of traffic. I walked along the path I had driven, hoping something would jog my memory. As I turned a corner, I saw a small, dimly lit park. It wasn't a place I usually passed, but something about it felt familiar. I sat on a bench, trying to recall any details from the lost hours. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my head, and my vision blurred. Flashes of distorting images flooded my mind, dark alleys, empty streets, and the eerie glow of streetlights. I gripped the bench, my knuckles white, as the memories came rushing back. I remember driving through the city, but it was different. The streets were empty, devoid of life. The buildings loomed over me, their windows like dark, empty eyes. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I realized I wasn't alone. There was something in the shadows, watching me. Its presence was palpable, but I couldn't see it. The memory faded, and I found myself back on the bench, gasping for breath. I knew I had to find out more about what had happened. My next stop was the local library. I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records, looking for any clues about the areas I had driven through. As I delved deeper, I discovered a series of strange occurrences that had taken place in those neighborhoods over the past few decades. People had reported seeing strange lights, hearing unexplained noises, and experiencing sudden, intense feelings of fear. One article caught my eye. It was about a bus driver who had disappeared under similar circumstances in 1927. The article mentioned that he had been seen driving through the city at odd hours, his bus empty. He had been found days later, wandering the streets in a daze, unable to remember what had happened. The only clue was a silver pocket watch found on him, which matched the description of the watch I had bought. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I wasn't the first to experience this. Determined to find answers, I decided to visit the last known address of the missing bus driver. The building was old and decrepit, its windows boarded up. I knocked on the door, hoping someone still lived there. An elderly woman answered, her eyes filled with sadness. She invited me in and offered me a cup of tea. As we sat in her dimly lit living room, I explained my situation. She listened intently, her expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. My grandfather was that bus driver, she said softly. He never recovered from what happened to him. He was never the same after those lost hours. He kept talking about the watch, how it seemed to take control of him. I asked her if she knew anything about what might have caused these experiences. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know why, but I do know that the watch has been passed down through our family, bringing misfortune to anyone who possesses it. I left her house feeling more confused and terrified than ever. I had to know what was happening to me and how to stop it. That night, I decided to confront the watch directly. I placed it on the kitchen table, the dim light casting eerie shadows on its surface. As midnight approached, the air grew colder, and the watch seemed to tick louder, filling the room with a sinister rhythm. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the lights. I fumbled for the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The watch was gone. Panic surged through me as I frantically searched the room. Just then, I heard a scraping noise behind me. I spun around, and the beam of the flashlight fell on a dark figure standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The figure moved closer, and I could see its twisted, malevolent grin. I backed away, heart pounding. Why are you doing this to me? I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure remained silent, its eyes piercing into mine. I felt a sharp pain in my head, and the world around me began to blur. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, glowing brighter and more intense. When I woke up, I was back on the bus, parked at the depot. My head throbbed, and I felt a deep sense of exhaustion. The memory of the figure was still vivid in my mind, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to find out what it wanted and how to stop it. Over the next few days, I continued to piece together the lost hours, revisiting the places I had driven through. I discovered that the watch had a dark history. It had once belonged to a man named Edgar Hawthorne, a bus driver in the 1920s who had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. Consumed by rage and a desire for revenge, he had performed a dark ritual, binding his spirit to the watch in a desperate bid to clear his name. The curse was activated every few decades, drawing in those who possessed the watch and using them to fulfill his vengeful purpose. As the days passed, the city itself seemed to suffer the consequences of the curse. Reports of strange occurrences increased, accidents, sudden blackouts, and unexplained phenomena became more frequent. It was as if the watch's dark energy was spreading, affecting everyone around me. One particularly horrifying incident involved a massive blackout that caused a citywide panic. Traffic lights failed, leading to numerous car accidents. Several fires broke out due to electrical malfunctions, and emergency services were overwhelmed. The chaos and destruction were unlike anything I had ever seen, and I couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at me, knowing I was somehow responsible. Determined to break the curse, I sought out the help of a local historian named Dr. Hammond, who specialized in the occult. With his guidance, we researched various methods to cleanse the watch of its dark energy. Dr. Hammond suggested a ritual that required specific ingredients and precise timing. We would need to perform the ritual at the exact moment of a lunar eclipse, which was only days away. As the night of the eclipse approached, the strange occurrences in the city intensified. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and whispers filled the air. On the night of the eclipse, we gathered in an abandoned church on the outskirts of the city, a place Dr. Hammond assured me was consecrated ground. The ritual required a circle of salt, candles, and the recitation of ancient incantations. As we began, the air grew colder, and the candles flickered. The watch lay in the center of the circle, glowing with an unnatural light. As we chanted, the ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the oppressive presence I had felt for weeks grew stronger. Suddenly, the dark figure appeared, its eyes burning with rage. It lunged at me, knocking over the candles and disrupting the circle. The force of its attack sent me sprawling, and the watch skittered across the floor. Dr. Hammond shouted for me to complete the ritual, but the figure was relentless, its icy grip tightening around my throat. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from the figure's grasp and grabbed the watch. I knew I had to finish the ritual. Ignoring the pain and the cold, I placed the watch back in the center of the circle and continued the incantation. The figure screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul, and lunged at me once more. In a final, desperate effort, I threw the watch into the air and smashed it with a heavy candlestick. The watch shattered into 1,000 pieces, fragments scattering across the room. The dark figure let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into the darkness. The pain in my head lessened, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We had done it. We had broken the curse. In the days that followed, the city began to recover from the chaos. The strange occurrences stopped, and the dark presence was no longer a threat. I continued driving my bus, but I always kept a watchful eye on the rearview mirror, just in case. The memory of the lost hours and the devastation I had caused would stay with me forever, but I had faced my fears and emerged stronger. The city was safe, and I had reclaimed my life from the darkness. The cursed pocket watch was no more, and its dark history had finally been put to rest.